Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace, unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. Every so often, I lay awake a bit longer than I should, and I get into this really bad habit of reflecting, but really in the sense of comparing myself to the expectations that the younger me set of myself. And recently, I did the same thing, and I really looked back, and I think back to, when was the last time I kind of really updated basically the expectations that I have set for myself. And I realized that to some degree, I'm still trying to, fulfill the expectations of the 17-year-old me who kind of set them for myself. And according to the plan, according to what 17-year-old me had kind of envisioned and had hoped, that at this point, maybe I would have figured out, or maybe I would have had been able to do, then at this point, I should have a business by now, because for some reason, I really wanted to be an entrepreneur at that point. I should also be with the person that I plan to marry. That is not happening. I should also be able to be a consistently generous person who can help everyone. I should know exactly where my life is going to head, and I should have more accomplishments, and I should be more emotionally regulated. All of this, if I'm just judging by her standards alone, then I haven't really been able to complete or fulfill her expectations. And as much as that kind of sucks, and I was thinking about this when I was having this kind of reflection moment, genuinely, I need to update my expectations for myself so that I can manage them a bit better. And also, my 17-year-old self, that was what, around 4 years ago? 4 years ago? Oh my God, 4 years ago. And she didn't necessarily have all the information, she didn't have many of the experiences that I've had since then. For instance, she didn't know what it felt like to actually fail an exam for the first time or barely pass a class. She didn't know what heartbreak felt like. She doesn't know what it feels like to be torn between pursuing academics and wanting a more of a creative lifestyle that's maybe not necessarily something considered really traditional. She didn't know what it feels like to barely have any energy for herself, let alone for other people. She didn't know that she's going to experience another depressive episode that made the world seem really dark. She didn't know a lot. And I think because, again, she didn't know a lot and she didn't have all these new experiences, she doesn't have enough information to be the one who's still determining the expectations for myself today. And I think the problem is not just with myself, but also with many people, is that I think a lot of us create expectations for ourselves based on limited information. And the reason why we do this is because we're not constantly going back and reintroducing ourselves and kind of updating what those expectations are supposed to look like, given a new season, given a new time, basically. And we kind of just keep using the same ones that we've established for ourselves in the past, even though we haven't even managed to hit maybe one of the targets or be able to present ourselves in the way that we had wanted to present ourselves, And I think because we continue to stick to these plans that we've made years ago in the past, when we didn't have all these new experiences that impacted us, what ends up happening is we keep punishing ourselves years later because life didn't unfold according to the plan that we had set. And I don't think the problem is that we have any goals. The problem isn't having goals. I've talked about goal setting. I've talked about what it means to build up discipline also in a softer way. I think that's really important as a person who is maybe ambitious, or as a person just in general. If you have any sort of drive, any sort of initiative, it's really important to have goals. And it's really important to strive for something that's more than just what you have right now. But I think the problem is that when it comes to, delivering on these goals, we're not looking at where we're currently at, and this does have to do with like focusing on what's your capacity at that moment, but also we're not acknowledging who we are. And I think that's also a bigger problem because you don't know what tools you're working with currently that you didn't have in the past, that you're not capitalizing on. And at the same time, you don't know maybe what weaknesses you're kind of having to deal with, or maybe where you need more support at that moment because you're not reintroducing yourself to yourself, and you're not kind of taking inventory on like what's happened, what's going on, and therefore you're not actually able to manage the expectations that you have set for yourself, and you're not able to even update them because, again, you don't even know where you're at. And I think that then doesn't even allow us to really hit our goals, and doesn't even allow us to kind of move forward because we're not even taking time to understand why there's such a big gap between where we want to be and who we are now, because we've failed again to update ourselves on who we are now. And the problem, like, when your standards stay frozen but you as a person changes, again, you don't know who you're dealing with. And the same way that people within our lives, as relationships, I don't want to say draw on, but as they continue to grow, a big part of that is consistently reintroducing like yourselves to each other. But what happens when you don't do that with yourself? And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today, which is basically all about understanding what your self-concept is. And this is a psychological term. Basically, it's a collection of beliefs and perceptions that you have about yourself. And before we get into this, what that even looks like, what that means, I understand that some of us are not comfortable with who we are. And we're not comfortable acknowledging some of our shortcomings, nor are we most times even comfortable acknowledging like what we're good at and maybe what we're doing like really well in. And that's why I want to hold your hand and kind of hold my hand as we go into this, because I understand that for some of us, this may also be the first time that we kind of really go into a bit more depth and like take the time to, really understand who we are. And I know it's kind of daunting because if you haven't really spent that much time with yourself, let alone actually like, ask yourselves a lot of questions, then I don't know, sometimes it's a bit scary to understand what the answer is. And it's also kind of sometimes disappointing to hear that you're not where you want to be. But that's exactly why we have to do this and why we have to understand ourselves so that we can get to the places that we want to be. But you cannot do that if you're still trying to avoid who you are. So I know that this is a scary thing to do, but it's a necessary discomfort. And I think the more you continue to practice reintroducing yourself and understanding who you are at that moment, then the more you're able to basically make sure that you can align on your expectations and actually move forward and not constantly ask yourself, where did I go wrong? And have these moments where you're up till 3 a.m. asking yourself, why isn't it working out for me? Why haven't I become the person I want to become? And so let's get into this and understanding what our self-concept is. And basically, self-concept is made out of 3 aspects. So your self-image. So how do you see yourself right now? What's your personality like? What are the abilities that you have? What social roles do you maybe need to fulfill? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What's basically your current reality? Your ideal self, which is the person you're trying to become. So the future version of yourself that you aspire to be, which is something that I know even 17-year-old me, like we have this image basically that we want. But I think even when you're kind of, again, taking inventory on yourself, like within certain time frames, even that starts to change, And I think that's also a really good thing because, again, you have so much more information to work with now that you can also maybe not even reimagine what that ideal self is going to look like, but like definitely go more into depth and into detail. Then we have self-esteem, which is the last part of basically your self-concept. And that's how much do you value yourself and accept yourself. And I know this is a really hard thing for many people. I have still so much trouble with accepting myself. And I'm not even talking about loving yourself, but really just accepting myself. And so this is basically the relationship between who you are and who you think you should be. And I think a lot of suffering, a lot of punishing happens because there's sometimes so much distance between your self-image and your ideal self. And especially when your ideal self hasn't been updated kind of in a while, that gap continues to grow and grow. And then you kind of fall into these doom spirals again, like I said, like maybe like reflecting at 3 a.m. and you just kind of make yourself feel even more shitty that you haven't really been able to get there yet, you know? And that's again why we practice small like wins and practice gratitude in that sense. There's not many episodes, I've done an episode on that as well. And so there's different parts that help you cope with the fact, you know, that maybe you're not there all the way yet, but you are making slow progress, and you do kind of have to learn to appreciate that for yourself. But there's an episode all about that, so you can go check that out. So now that we understand basically what the self-concept is and what we need to kind of update on, first of all, can you just ask yourself right now, when was the last time you took time to reacquaint yourself with yourself? And for me, I usually do this like after every academic semester, but I definitely think I need to be doing it more frequently, just because a lot of things change, and then I've realized that I do have this kind of habit of starting to become disappointed, especially halfway through semesters, because I'm not able to manage the expectations that I had set for myself as well as I thought. And I keep expecting myself to kind of operate from this really 100% like Sinead, and the reality is though I'm only at 50%. You know, I'm not able to be at my peak productivity. I'm not able to be at my peak social and extroverted self. You know, I'm not able to be the highlight reel version of myself. And so that's something that you kind of have to sit down and acknowledge. And I think that's really important, because when you then go to kind of, I guess, re-update what your expectations of yourself are, you can do that from a standpoint of understanding that you know the realistic version of you. And so you can create realistic like expectations for yourself that not only will you be able to kind of like handle and manage, but you'll also be able to deliver on them. And so then you can kind of continuously close that gap of, you know, where you should be at versus where you are at right now, because you've been able to actually reacquaint yourself with you and understand what's going on at that point, and kind of give yourself more grace in the sense of, hey, you know, right now I cannot manage all these goals maybe, or right now I can't be the most generous person with all my friends, or I can't even be the person like where my friends like can go to right now, because right now all I can manage is basically myself. So it's just allowing you to kind of, I guess, yeah, maybe reduce kind of the expectations, or just re-envision them in a healthier way so that the real you can actually handle this. And so what does that actually look like? And, you know, how can we set expectations for ourselves, and what do we really need to consider? So I mentioned basically a lot of the points when I was kind of explaining what it means, like what a self-concept is. But let's go into this a bit more in depth. And I know this is a lot more questions, so feel free to take a break as you go through this. But let's start it off with, what are your strengths? You know, what are my strengths? And even as I'm trying to come up with examples for this, it's still something, and I mean like examples for who I currently am. It still was something that was really difficult to do for me, because, you know, I'm always someone who's like, okay, you know, I fixed this. Okay, what's the next problem, you know? And I still have problems with kind of like congratulating myself or like appreciating, you know, when I'm doing well with something. So let's get into what kind of mine were. So some of my strengths are like maybe like time management. I think also I'm really attentive when I want to be and when I can be. And I think that when I, again, have the time, the capacity for it, I can be a really good active listener. So I think those are some of my strengths that I have right now. Please notice that I said like when I have the time, when I have the capacity, because I mean, right now, I'm maybe not necessarily the best in terms of being like the most social person that I can be, but shit, that happens. And then moving from my strengths, I want you guys to ask yourself, okay, like what are your weaknesses, and this is not again to shame yourself, but it's to understand maybe where you need support or better systems, or maybe just where you have to understand that, okay, this is maybe something that I need to kind of focus on, especially if this, like some of my weaknesses are things that I want to improve on. And so for me, I think recently, what's been a weakness of mine is like genuinely like not knowing how to say no to taking on too much. And I mean that in terms of like not even taking on much from other people, but really just taking on so much for myself. Like right now, life is really kicking me. And it's kind of my own, it's not even kind of, it is my own fault. And so even though I'm good at time management, I think I'm not good at saying no sometimes to what I want to do, and I want to be able to do it all. But I feel like I haven't structured myself properly to handle that in this recent version of myself. So that's definitely a weakness of mine. And yeah, I think I just take on too much sometimes. I just don't know how to say no. So with that said, the next question really is then like, so what's your current capacity? And my current capacity is very low. It is very low. And in fact, I think sometimes I only have time for myself right now, and at least within these next 2 months. And it really kind of sucks because I feel like I'm missing out on a bigger social aspect. I still call my friends quite often and try to check in on them, but I can't do it to the same degree that I would like to. And so my current capacity right now is really only for myself. And I know that sounds really selfish, but that's the only way I'm going to be able to kind of, I guess, yeah, close the gap basically between where I'm at right now and where I want to go, especially with my goals. But yeah, in terms of kind of how I want to present myself, especially to other people, this isn't necessarily what I want, but I know realistically this is just where I'm at. And the next question to ask yourself is what have your emotional states been recently? Like what's most frequent, what's happening? And for me, if I'm being honest, like I would love to say that, oh, I can do it all and yeah, be so happy and positive all the time. But genuinely, I'm exhausted right now. I am really exhausted and I'm a bit lost too. I think that's because right now I'm on this like tunnel vision of just productivity, and it is, I would not say the best. And so this is something definitely like I'm going to take into consideration as I move forward. When it comes to taking on responsibilities next time, but also like maybe just like my coping strategies right now as well. But yeah, I would say a lot of times my emotional state is exhaustion, feelings that are lost, and then I mean occasionally there's just like a lot of, I'm so grateful for what's going on for me and how I'm able to move through that. I'm able to at least, and struggling to. But that's kind of where my emotional state is and has been at. And so coming to another question to ask yourself basically in order to understand where you're currently at is maybe what season are you in? And for me, I'm in a season of monotonous routine. It's something that I used to like, at least in the past months, like when I lived in the Netherlands or lived in Belgium, studied in the Netherlands, I really liked it. But right now, it's not really giving me the same kind of feeling, and I don't really like it as much. And this is something that I definitely don't want to do again in the future. So that's something that I have to take into consideration as well, like just moving forward. And lastly, something to also ask yourself, like basically it's kind of like already targeted, like a lot of the question, like it's already been targeted in all of the questions that I've already asked. But what are your priorities right now? And this is so that you can understand, okay, exactly where you can put the time and effort, especially if like you're like myself and right now you just don't have that much time or that much capacity for a lot of other things. And so this is then where you can actually set the goals that you have for yourself and, set proper and realistic expectations, understanding also what you're working with. And so for me, my priorities right now are finish this semester. Oh my gosh, I just need to finish this semester. Figure out my thesis is also another big part. And I think for me, it's just right now managing to be consistent and not perfect. And if I look around my life right now, that's kind of the big theme for me, is just practicing consistency, even if it's not perfect. And I think another big priority for myself right now is just keeping whatever energy that I do have, keeping that to myself right now, which is also, I don't want to say it's selfish because I have my reasons for it, but it's definitely not something, again, that I just want to be focusing on in the future. But I think it's really good that I can understand that this is going to be a priority of mine, because I know what I have to do, and I know that I kind of need to be in this season right now of, me, and season of making sure that I can still manage with me, at least. And so these are just some of the questions that you kind of can ask yourself to kind of get reacquainted a bit more. And this is all, again, about helping you to guide you basically to understand what your current self is. And so maybe that will then help you to kind of reimagine a better time frame, and also not just time frame, but also kind of what it is you expect, like, from your ideal self, basically. And this again goes all into like setting up your goals properly, because even though we as people are really complex, even for us, we can set goals, not just for like external things that we want to do, but also for, ourselves. And so definitely go ahead and check out episode 2 of the Uncomfortable Podcast so that you can understand how to set those properly, because that does definitely tie into managing your expectations a bit more. But yeah, these are some questions to kind of help you to understand where you're currently at. And please notice that a lot of these, at least for my answers, like, they're not what you want to hear. I feel like that's a big thing that I realize about myself, is that I'm usually I'm usually not necessarily the ideal version of myself. Like, I think I'm not the ideal version of myself, or it just doesn't sound as pretty or as nice as I would like it to be, but it's the realistic picture of myself. And even though I can't tell you 100% that I love that, I can't, because I can tell you right now, I really don't like the fact that I don't have time for other people. But I can accept that I'm like this right now. And I can accept it because I see my efforts, and that's something that I just value about myself. But it's not necessarily, like, this isn't nice to say out loud that I have some of these strengths and some of these weaknesses even. And it's not nice to, I guess, sometimes hear that, like, my priorities are a bit just focused on me. I think right now, especially because, like, I'm in Germany again, and, like, my parents are close and my friends are close, but I really don't have all the capacity, and I try as best as I can. But I also know that right now everything is really limited in that sense. And so, yeah, I kind of struggle with sometimes knowing where I'm currently standing. But because I know where I'm currently standing, I'm able to set, like, more realistic kind of goals for myself. And so therefore, I don't continue to disappoint myself by the fact that maybe right now I'm not the most perfect daughter. I don't go to see my parents all the time because I can't right now. And so in some sense, it is kind of, this is definitely helpful to understand where you're currently at. And that's why like even checking in with yourself matters, why updating your self-concept matters, so that you can operate from the space that you are actually currently in. And not just like operate from, or try to operate basically from this, like the expectations that like your past you has set when maybe you had more time or when you had more resources. And with that said, because it's great if we can maybe like kind of bypass like, you know, the expectations that our younger us had set for ourselves. But then even when we've kind of gotten out of that headspace, now comes the problem of like, sometimes we're still like kind of comparing our expectations and who we definitely are to like the people around us, and people whose lives basically look like ours, but they have completely different outcomes. And I have this really big issue, because sometimes, you know, I think especially with like social media, I see people and I see their lives, and it's like, oh, we're living the same life, but they look so different to me. They look like they have, you know, everything kind of like figured out and managed. And I always then ask myself this question, because when I get into this habit of comparing myself, oh my gosh, I will spiral out of control with it, and I will really just continue to dig at myself, and that's not going to be beneficial for me in the end. So I always ask myself, like, how much do you really know about this person? You know, and even when I'm comparing myself sometimes to really close friends of mine, even if I know every single part of their lives, I don't know how they process shit. I don't know what they actually feel like, what's going on in their head, you know? And so you can know a person so much, but the only person who you can actually ask these questions to, like really in-depth questions, and get the actual answer from is yourself. And that kind of allows me to kind of redirect all that energy about questioning and wondering and comparing. And it all comes back to, okay, but who can I get these answers from? Like, and about who? And the only person is me. And so that kind of allows me to refocus basically, and kind of, you know, make sure that I have myself like in check, and I don't just spend so much time looking at other people, you know, and wondering how they're able to manage it all. Because if I'm wondering so much about how they're managing it all, then when the hell am I going to wonder how I'm going to manage it all? And honestly, especially for me personally, with like the limited energy and but the limited energy that I have, like, I really need to focus on putting that towards myself and asking myself what's going on. And that's kind of where my priority needs to be. And all this to say that when it comes to hitting your targets and getting, like, you know, to the version that you want to be, sometimes you don't need to work harder, you know? Sometimes you just need to realign your expectations and make sure that you're not, you know, still sticking with the past ones that you had, or comparing the expectations that you want to set for yourself versus the person who has like completely different ones, even if on paper you guys look like you have identical lives. And the only way you can do this is if you actually know yourself, which means knowing your weaknesses, which means knowing your strengths, and acknowledging sometimes that you're not at the peak version of you maybe, but that's okay, you know? And the only way to continue to close that gap to the peak version of yourself is if you're actually working with what you realistically have right now, and not constantly expecting so much more from yourself, which is only going to end up to lead to more disappointment, you know? And I know this sounds like a cycle, because it is a cycle, and that's why it's so important that we break it and actually sit down and reintroduce ourselves so that we can execute with what we do have, you know? And I think as you're sitting down to kind of talk to yourself more, what you start to understand is more about your values, more about your habits, more about your patterns, you know, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And I think because a lot of this isn't just about like taking inventory of like what's going on with you currently, but also reflecting and understanding how certain experiences have shaped you and have impacted you. You also are able to give yourself more credit in terms of how you handle those experiences. And you're also able to acknowledge that they had an impact on you, because you're not someone who's bulletproof, you know? Things are going to hurt you. Things are going to set you back maybe, you know, and vice versa. Things are maybe also going to allow you to move forward or give you an advantage. And you need to understand this and take the time to actually reflect and sit down with yourself and say, hey, this is Sinead. This is the current Sinead, and this is what we're dealing with. Not even dealing with sounds really bad. So maybe this is what we have to work with right now. And we're really excited, but we do have to know that sometimes we're not going to be at the most, ideal version of ourselves, but we can get there and we can move on with what we have. But again, you need to kind of update yourself on yourself, which sounds really weird, but you kind of get the gist at this point. And so coming to the end of this all, the question I want you guys to ask yourself, even though there's been a lot of questions between, because maybe you feel right now that you're not someone who this actually particularly pertains to, I want you to ask yourself, whose expectations, goals, or visions for yourself are you actually trying to live up to right now? And genuinely, if you can't tell yourself right now that you haven't really, it's the version of you whose expectations you're trying to manage, then you need to update yourself. You need to get a bit more reacquainted. And the same way you want to get reacquainted with other people, the same way, it works within our relationships, it also has to work with that relationship that you have with yourself. And so I know that takes time, and I know it actually is also a lot of, kind of back and forth with yourself, because it's really hard to be actually honest with yourself. But it's worth it, because how else are we going to get to the point and get to the kind of ideal version of ourselves if we're not even going to be honest about who we are currently? And so with that said, thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope that it gave you guys a lot to think about, and I hope you guys take the time to sit down, process, reflect, get reacquainted, and enjoy spending this time with yourself to really kind of nail down who you are and then execute with what you have and with who you are at this point. Guys, thanks so much for listening. Bye. Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go ahead and check out our TikTok and our Instagram for more content. Bye.